It's a pleasure to be here. I often come up to Ithaca in the summers, and I rarely hear them when academic term is in, and it's just amazing to see the place so vibrant and right now so beautiful and also so warm. And it's been a pleasure to be here so far. Just a word about myself before I get going. So most of my previous work, and I've been working in the field really since about 1990, so really just after the 1989 revolutions. I graduated from college, believe it or not, in 1989. And that's kind of how I made my way into this field. But most of my work has been in the area of political economy. It was just mentioned, my last book was actually about a sort of resume of the effects of the changes that happened in 1989, just socioeconomic impacts, together with an anthropologist. And it's really only since 2014, which has already been some time, that I've been working on the area of foreign policy of Central and Eastern Europe. That happened largely because I was teaching at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C., which is a top school of international affairs in the United States. And I realized as soon as I started working in DC that nobody cared at all in DC about like domestic politics or political economy of countries in this area. And we're only interested in foreign policy. So I got really, in a way, another PhD, I would say, in foreign policy. And I started working with a former US ambassador to Czechoslovakia, who I continue to work with in my think tank role, the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, on democratic backsliding and in general sort of Russian attempts to influence the region. And that turned into that project in the class that I teach on Russia and East Europe international affairs, turned into my first book called Lands in Between: Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War, which was published by Oxford in 2019. And what I'm going to present today is a kind of sequel, I guess. It's the beginning of my next major project in this area of foreign policy. And that is how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is changing Europe. So what I'm going to outline for you today is rather broad. You could think of this as a broad overview of a book project. You could think of it as a set of hypotheses that I'm going to be testing in the work that I'm planning to do. And also, I just wanted to mention at the very beginning that although I'm talking in very broad terms here, I also have a lot of specialist knowledge in each of these areas for a number of different reasons. And so in the question and answers, don't feel afraid to ask me specific questions. I'll get down to brass tacks like very quickly. Part of the reason that, well, a lot of the specifics come, I think this is the article you just read was my introduction to a special issue in the Journal of European Integration on transformation of Europe after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was produced by an interesting process. We had a call for papers, and we got 60 proposals, actually, I think, from mostly European scholars about what they thought was happening. And so I had an opportunity to, in a way, review the entire field, what was going on, choose what I thought were the best, dozen or so papers, and work with the authors to kind of sew them together in some type of narrative and get their comments also on my work. And in addition, I have been planning a research project. I'll talk a bit more about that just at the end if I have time. And also, I just have come back from a trip to Poland and Slovakia where I had the opportunity to go to two really high-level international security conferences or international affairs conferences, one of which is the Warsaw Security Forum, similar to the Munich Security Conference. It's like a huge conference that brings together a lot of world leaders from this area of the world, as well as military leaders, foreign policy leaders. So that's, part of, and then I also attended a GlobeSec conference in Slovakia that was also more economic focused, but also got to see the EU representatives to Ukraine, et cetera. So I'm going to talk very generally, but if you ever have any questions about specifics, I can go on like too extensively about that. That's why I try to avoid it a little bit. But the main points that I'm going to make here is that that Europe has a lot to congratulate itself about in its reaction to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly with regard to its actions as a economic superpower and humanitarian power of the world. But it has faced very, very dramatic security challenges, which I'll discuss. It has also been forced to reconsider the borders of Europe. The enlargement process in Europe, which has been stalled for a decade, has now been relaunched, in my view. And I think we also need to talk about unfolding changes to the internal politics of the European Union. And that's the main points, all of which I think can be encompassed within a framework of talking about a more geopolitical Europe. That is a phrase that some European leaders in fact use. And I'm, I guess, trying to put meat on the bones a little bit about what that exactly looks like, what that means. So in particular, I think that where Europe will head probably is towards more of an internal zone of integration, but more of an external zone of power projection, or some might say principled pragmatism in its position towards the rest of the world, whereas the European Union in general has tried with Russia and with other parts of the world to use its methods of integration to also be a factor in its external policy. I think that has come to a halt, particularly to Russia's concern. Now, before we get into all the problems that Europe has faced, because in Europe, people, as here, I suppose, love to dwell on all the problems because those are the most juicy and important things to talk about. But I think we have to take a second to think about the important successes that the European Union in particular had with regard to this invasion. First of all, there was an extremely quick reaction that I think was surprising to most people. I think it was surprising to me just how fast the European Union reacted in slapping some of the most substantial economic sanctions in world history, I guess, on Russia, which is a neighboring country / empire. That showed a very, very quick ability to act and to try to impose substantial costs on Russia for the invasion. The European Union also invoked what's called a temporary protection directive that was approved in 2001, but never actually enacted for the first time, which enabled Ukrainian refugees to access accommodation, labor markets, medical care, education for minors, and social assistance throughout the Union, including, I think, even free train tickets in a lot of places. So that was the first time it had happened. A lot of people in Europe have debated why it didn't happen with the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, 2016. But it has to be said that it did happen this time, and that was a very substantial sort of Europeanization of the refugee regime that occurred quickly. It also, and perhaps this is the most surprising, the European Union utterly changed its energy policy very fast. I think it was in March, within a month or so, the European Union utterly switched its energy policy. And I have a lot to say about energy policy. This is an area I follow very closely, and have an article I wrote at the Foreign Policy Research Institute if you're interested in that. But essentially, it changed, its policy had been to sort of replace coal and other highly polluting fossil fuels with cheap Russian gas, essentially, as a sort of transition to a cleaner energy. But after the invasion, it very substantially increased its investments in renewable energy to achieve more self-sufficiency as well as clean energy goals. And it's planning now to increase renewables as a percent of the total energy share in Europe to 45%. The US, by the way, is at around 12% presently. Europe is probably about double that at the current time. So this is a very, very substantial shift, as you can imagine. So in this, I think we can say that the European Union in particular had a really powerful and unified response. And I like to sort of wave the European flag, because we do that a lot in the United States, but I think in Europe it's really unusual. I thought I would just do that. But the security challenges, at the same time, Europe has been enmeshed. And in fact, most of the papers that I received, I mentioned I sent out a call for papers. Most of the papers I received were agonizing over the security challenges that Europe has faced. Because basically the European Union was caught flat-footed in its security response and was totally unable to deliver a timely or unified response. Julian Holworth, who's a really well-known British expert on European foreign policy, wrote that the crisis in Ukraine has highlighted the weakness of the EU as an international actor. Although the EU is an economic, commercial, and regulatory giant, it has not succeeded in emerging as a significant military or security actor. And you could go into different dimensions of why this was true, but I think the one that stands out to me the most is really the decision-making factor. That European leaders of the 27 member states simply weren't able to decide how they wanted to respond or in a unified way about the security challenges, right? With Germany and France, you know, the two of the big three, now the big two, I guess, of European Union security, having been devoted prior to the invasion to a more Russia first type of security policy that prioritized having good relations with Russia, even if that meant not arming Ukraine, not arming really Europe either. And being left in a position where I've been attending a few, online, a few French seminars about security and, leaving them in a position where, although France has a substantial military, it has nuclear capabilities, it also has a force de frappe where it can, quickly airlift soldiers to Mali, for instance, if it needs to do that. But it doesn't have any capability of defending Europe from an armored attack, for instance, of the type that we've seen in Ukraine. Germany has extremely had low abilities as well, and simply it has taken the political classes in those countries several months, if not over a year, to really come around to a position where they want to offer forceful resistance, in which case that would have been too late for Ukraine. And in fact, European Union ended up not responding well, I think, to the challenge of the day. And the response was made instead by NATO, primarily with US leadership, at least in this initial period. So the invasion, I think, shattered any remaining illusions. A lot of people debate, did Europe still have illusions about having peace through integration with Russia? But in fact, that had been the strategy for a long time. The idea that Germany had, in particular France as well, was that the more integration there is with Russia, the more we build high-speed rails between different cities in Russia and foster economic development in Russia, the more they will eventually have a peaceful relationship towards their neighbors and towards the European Union. That was utterly destroyed by this invasion. More so, some feel that Europe lost its sense of security, right? That now Europe now feels vulnerable to an invasion for the first time, really since 1945, right? With the fact of a major land war, happening very close by. And some call that undermining the ontological security, but also some of the foundational myths of Europe, the idea of the European Union, there was an ever greater community of those dedicated to peace, to creating peaceful relationship. Well, that was also shattered. And it's not clear to some how it can be reconstructed. To others, they raise questions about whether Europe can rise to the challenge of a liberal international order in general, not just in Europe, but in general throughout the world. And we're seeing pieces that in the Middle East that's in the process of fragmentation or disintegration, right? And so does Europe really have the ability to manage that? And the answer to a lot of people is no, even if they wish that they did. And they wish for a type of strategic autonomy from the US or just in general. And then there's another debate about whether the EU is becoming more integrated in the security sphere, which I think the answer is yes, but not at a pace that is going to very quickly render the EU to be a major sort of global power in a military sense. It doesn't appear to be set up that way. And most of the integration has occurred really within NATO. NATO was the big winner in the security space. NATO, which had been challenged in its kind of raison d'etre, was reaffirmed largely by the war. And this is very annoying to many Europeans. especially to Emmanuel Macron, who had this wonderful speech about strategic autonomy. And that has become the buzzword of those who generally want to see a European security identity and capability that's independent of the United States, therefore independent of NATO. And so that's an important feature in this debate, which is not going to end soon. The other major impact that that the war has had is on the borders of Europe. And this is an interesting one because a lot of Europeans have been very reluctant to talk about enlargement, reluctant to talk about borders. I know that not in this room, Mabel Beresin has a book about borders, Europe's borders, I believe. But this war has caused already a major shift in Europe's borders. And a hardening, I would say, of Europe's borders. That Finland and almost Sweden have joined NATO, and so now I'm talking about Europe. I'm using it as sort of a little bit of a blanket term to talk about the major institutions of European security, which I consider to be NATO and the European Union, although there are some others. Actually, the Council of Europe, some say would have been utterly destroyed. Maybe I should add a section on that by this war because of the membership of Russia and other in that council and its inability to also operate in that way. But there's no doubt that that NATO has expanded to the north and east very significantly, with Finland having a 900-mile long border with Russia. And Sweden and Finland together having very, very substantial defense capabilities and ability to project power, particularly into the Baltic region, with the Baltic Sea now becoming basically a NATO lake, with the ability of NATO states now to utterly restrict Russian movement within the Baltic Sea. Although it may not do that, but it has the capability to do that. Which of course is leading to some, pipeline explosions and other sort of acts of resistance, I think, by Russia. Also importantly, this was not restricted to NATO, but also the European Union has decided to give Ukraine and Moldova candidate status. And you could say, well, that's not really changing the borders of Europe, but I would suggest that it is very substantially. Ukraine and I would say Moldova are on the path to membership at this point. The enlargement process has been reignited, and a lot of people have questioned and debated whether Ukraine and Moldova will face the same fate as the Western Balkan nations, which have been in a kind of purgatory for all these years, waiting to see what will happen. And there's an argument that that's convenient for the European Union to put control over these countries while not having any obligations, particularly to them. Or is this going to be an expedited process, which has been called for by Ukraine? I think is, well, I guess we'll see about that. That's an, ongoing debate, but no question enlargement is back on the agenda and is, I think, moving forward in really important ways. Internal politics, and then I'll try to wrap up because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm much better answering questions than I am at presenting things. But I think that internally there's been some very substantial shifts also. One of them has been the loss of face that I mentioned for France and Germany. These were the purported security leaders of Europe, and the strategy that they embraced of some sort of détente or some sort of accordance or some sort of integration with Russia utterly failed, and has now been recognized to have failed in Germany and in France, largely. That was something that came through really clearly to me at the Warsaw Security Forum, where I heard there were a lot of German military, also German social democratic politicians, a lot of various leaders of German foreign policy saying essentially the Zeitenwende. I don't know if you've heard about this term, the Zeitenwende, but very shortly after the war broke out, the German chancellor said there's a Zeitenwende, an epical change or a transition from the old way that we dealt with Russia to a new approach. And people criticized that and said, well, you said that, but it's not really happening. I want to just tell everybody it's definitely happening, right? Germany is now the #2 security provider to Ukraine of weapons. Initially, it was humiliated for having offered 5,000 helmets or something to Ukraine. and not allowing flyovers of British aircraft delivering weapons to Ukraine. Now it's a major arms export and very dedicated to Ukraine, to EU enlargement for Ukraine, maybe more dedicated to NATO enlargement to Ukraine than the United States is at this point. And so there's been a big shift, but that shift is partly coming as a result of this loss of face that these countries had, where, for instance, at a meeting I attended in France via Zoom, it was stated that, you know, why should France rearm? Well, because actually France could end up being the third largest military in Europe, behind Poland and behind Germany, right? So at the same time, there's been a rise of Poland in the frontline states. It's widely spoken in European circles that the frontline states were right about Russia, we were wrong. That's commonly repeated, including by the president of the European Commission, and many other leaders openly agree with that. The Poles, of course, have a lot of interest in saying that and do very frequently. And what that's done is it's sort of elevated Poland, which is also engaged much more rapidly in a military buildup, to the high table of European security. I think it's more able to take that role now that there's a new government coming to power, which is more liberal and less anti-EU. But in any case, it was developing into much more of a security voice within Europe. And there's also big shifts in public opinion and sentiment within Europe, hardening of opinion about Russia. Interestingly, the view that, well, not everybody in Europe supports arming Ukraine. There's very few people who would support arming Russia, for instance, right? Practically nobody, right? Except on the very far extremes. And interestingly, even among the extreme right, there's a division. The extreme right is often identified with Putin, but you can see Meloni in Italy is being very supportive, a far-right politician who's in government presently, very supportive of Ukraine rather than Russia. So even the far-right is quite split on that issue. All right, I'm going to go quickly over this but I just want to say that that the European Union, often the way European Union scholars think about the European Union is as this zone of integration and security through integration. However, European security has always had two faces to it. It's always had that approach of peace through integration, and also the NATO approach of peace through strength. And those two have really been hand in hand in generating security. And I was looking, I decided, okay, I need an image, that's like cool, like how can I show this? And I found this really interesting Mars and Venus painting by Botticelli from 1483, which shows Venus, resting with Mars. And I'm renaming it the allegory of the European security and defense policy. And I was trying to get the various satyrs to find faces of Macron or in there, but I didn't succeed in doing that. I tried, but anyway, I just want to reach a conclusion and then offer plenty of time for discussion, which is basically what, and maybe one more point on the internal politics. The other thing that's happening in the internal politics that I picked up a bit on my most recent visit, a lot of people are again relaunching this sort of multi-speed Europe discourse. So people are saying, well, maybe this is a way we can achieve enlargement through a multi-speed Europe, right? That we can take in more countries, perhaps Ukraine, Moldova, or even the Western Balkans, but not offer full integration into European institutions, but membership in the European Union of a more limited kind. And when they're ready, we can bring them up into full integration. So that discourse is already being generated. It's another change, in the way Europe is potentially going to operate that I guess is being discussed. So what I would see is that we're facing a more geopolitical Europe. What's changing in Europe, it is becoming a more geopolitical Europe. It's the European Union not only as an economic superpower, with NATO projecting peace through strength, but also Europe defining its borders more clearly, defining who's in and defining who's out. The European approach to borders, in one of the funny videos I play for my class, it was portrayed as a kumbaya approach, like, everybody, whatever border is not really important. And in fact, the enlargement, the theoretical space of Europe was actually infinite, right? So there was no defined real limit actually to where Europe could expand. And if you know the neighborhood policy, the eastern neighborhood, there's also a southern neighborhood, which includes Palestine, by the way. It also includes Lebanon. It also includes the Maghreb, essentially. So the idea had been that Europe that eventually, in theory, anybody could really join the European Union. I think that is going to be replaced now, at least in the East, with a kind of much more defined set of boundaries. That what's happening in Ukraine is very significant. I think is the European Union telling Ukraine, you're part of Europe. You're part of the European family. I love that phrase because it was so, it seemed so like vague and yet so specific, right? And promising some countries that they will enjoy membership in the European Union, and clearly telling other countries you will not be doing that, right? Because of X, Y, or Z, which is something that had not been really European policy, I don't think, before. So what is merging in short is a clearer definition of this zone of integration, what it may entail, and a clear view that Europe now needs to look at the rest of the world as a potential challenge, maybe not to integrate quite as much with China, not integrate, of course, and to resist Russia, act very strongly to resist Russia. And unfortunately, one of the it was Joseph Borrell used the term, I forget exactly the quote. He said, but he used the term. I think what he said was European Union is a garden, and the rest of the world is a jungle. And he was roundly criticized for that, I think rightly. Because of some of the sort of racial implications of the term. But I think that is in fact kind of where European policy is heading, towards much more of a defined sphere, and we can debate what defines that sphere. But I think I think what he meant was more it's tidy and neat, and other places that are challenging and have to regard the world as a more challenging place rather than a place that ultimately can be encompassed through integration. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually on leave this semester. I'm working on a study of expert opinion in Europe, which is based on a database of all. Really, ideally like to have every word that any think tank in Europe has produced about Ukraine, and to subject it to text analysis to discover some of the key themes that change over time, the diffusion of ideas, the leaders and the laggards, evidence of European policy discourse rather than national policy discourse, and also to use the database as a way to sample interviews. So a lot of my work is done through interview techniques, and I plan to do that as well. But I want to know their full range of opinion before I can start to, and who the thought leaders are before I interview people. And study key drivers, also correlates of the shifts in European expert discourse, such as events, in particular governmental actions. Those are the key techniques that I'm using going forward, is to test some of the hypotheses that I presented. So thanks so much.